All right. Well, good afternoon, folks. We're here at the, we've got the latest edition of Landscape and Arboriculture South Florida webinar series. Today's speaker is Dr. Jason Smith from the University of Florida. He's kind of understood to be the expert for all things diseases and trees for the state. And so with that, I guess I just request everybody keep themselves muted and all of that throughout the presentation. With that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Smith here.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully this is informative. I don't know how many people are here that have been okay, I see it. You're going to admit other people come in. I don't know how many people are here as part of the extension excuse me, that are here as part of IFAS extension, and how many of you are here as arborists and in terms of working in the industry. But I suspect we have kind of a diversity of backgrounds, which is totally the way most of these typically go, and that's kind of the audience that I prepared this for. If I can get the if I can move my taskbar out of the way here, so there we go. So I can start this. Can everybody see the screen okay? Does that work?
Looks good.
Okay, good. So I wanted to give everybody an update on current tree disease issues and some abiotic disorders affecting trees in Florida, to clarify some misconceptions along the way and provide an opportunity for you to ask some questions if you'd like. And so it'll hopefully give you an opportunity to fill in some blanks with any kind of presentation like this. Again, and we have a range of backgrounds and experience levels, and so there's going to be people in the audience who, for some of this, this will be obviously review. For some of you, it might be completely new. And so what I intend to do is to provide some background, a little bit of background information and some things that I'm sure, will be review for some of you, but then there will be some new things that we'll be talking about that I suspect some of you aren't aware of. And so with that said, I just want to kind of talk about just some basic things about tree diseases and explain to you kind of how we view tree health when we think about the diagnostic process and thinking about trees as living organisms. So one of the issues that we deal with trees is that, well, first of all, they're different from a lot of other plants in the landscape. They're long-lived, they're large. A lot of the living biomass is underground. They're, of course, they produce wood, that's part of the stem tissue is wood, which is unique. And because of these features, diagnosis is distinctly different for trees than it might be for, a lot of other plants in the landscape, herbaceous plants in particular. And so because of that, diagnostics sometimes requires a combination of having information about the background of the site, background of the site and things like that, which we'll talk about in a minute. But there's a lot of different diagnostic techniques. We'll talk, we're going to talk about some of the causal agents of tree diseases. I'll give you some examples, and we'll be talking about some of the sort of the new and ongoing issues that are affecting trees here in Florida. And talk about why some of those things are sort of re-emerging or becoming problematic, particularly in the urban landscape, and talk about obviously control and prevention when appropriate. And let's see. So one of the key concepts that we always want to remind people of or present to you when talking about disease is the disease triangle. And this is a good way to conceptualize what happens when you have the interaction between a susceptible host, a environment that's conducive for disease development, and a pathogen which is known to be virulent. And what I'm trying to say here is that for disease to happen, you need to have all three of these components to come together. You have to have all three of these components lining up. And this is important for several things. It's important for understanding sort of the disease biology and sort of the disease cycle, but it's also important for management, very important for management, because anytime we want to manage a disease in the landscape, we can conceptualize what's going on using this paradigm, and we can target the disease in utilizing integrated pest management. For example, we can target all three of these components, and especially in an urban landscape, and in some cases, and then also it can sometimes be helpful for even diagnosis. If there's a host that we know is particularly susceptible, it's sort of known for being susceptible to a certain disease or certain pathogen, and then that you've had an environmental condition that's conducive for that disease, and under certain conditions, then you can sort of use the process of elimination or use deduction to help with coming up with at least a hypothesis for a diagnosis. Some good examples of this are, we've had a very kind of unusual spring, at least here in North Florida, in the sense that it was particularly dry, but it was a lot cooler than normal. And then we, finally we're starting to get some rain, but it's very, very dry here and very cool comparatively. And those kinds of conditions favor powdery mildew, for example, on a lot of hosts. Powdery mildew is a fungal disease that is caused by a number of different pathogens. And although high humidity is part of the disease triangle, it's not favored by wet conditions. Rather, what we consider to be free water on the surfaces of the plant leaves. So when you have cool, sort of humid, especially nights and early mornings, and then you have kind of a little bit cooler conditions during the day, especially in the spring, you can get a lot more powdery mildew than normal. We have had that. We've had a lot of powdery mildew on a lot of different hosts that are known to be susceptible, things like crepe myrtles, certain oaks, and other species. That's just an example, but there's lots and lots of examples of this. So we'll talk more about that as we go, because I'm going to use some examples. So prevention requires knowledge of what is normal. It's really, really critical. I mean, if you're going to try to understand what's going on and diagnose something, you need to understand what's considered to be normal, in quotes. In other words, what is normal phenology for the host, in terms of does a species you're looking at, does it normally shed leaves at a certain time of the year? Does it normally have lichens on the bark like we're seeing here? Being able to recognize the signs and symptoms of disease, which we'll talk more about here in a minute, is really very important. And that's something that takes skill. It takes, over time, we get better at that. There's certain ways we can learn how to differentiate the difference between something that is not considered to be a disease issue versus something that is. But that's sort of it should be a no-brainer, but it is something that we run into a lot. There's a lot of people that sort of characterize or misunderstand what they're seeing in the landscape because they're not familiar with the ecology of the system. They're not familiar with the species. They're not familiar with the typical phenology of the species that they're looking at. So categories of disease, we're going to talk about some things here. So abiotic disorders aren't technically diseases because they're not caused by an infectious a pathogen, something that is transmissible. But we will talk about some abiotic damage that's can happen to trees. I'm going to talk about that just and sort of include them generally in the category here, and explain how we differentiate certain types of abiotic disorders. And I'm particularly focused on sort of some issues that are affecting trees in Florida currently. And then, of course, we have the biotic pathogens, the infectious agents that cause disease in trees. And the primary category is fungi. Fungi make up the vast majority of pathogens in plants, in contrast to in mammals, where we have bacteria and viruses as our primary pathogen types in trees, and in plants it's mostly fungi, but we do have bacterial pathogens and viruses in plants as well, and other organisms, things like, nematodes, which are, parasitic worms, essentially, little microscopic worms that can cause disease. We have parasitic plants even that can parasitize plants, things like, mistletoe, and there's others. So, and then there are complex things that can happen in trees because they're long-lived, and these have been sort of described variously over the years as complexes, declines, syndromes, because they involve the interaction of some of these different biotic agents, sometimes with acute or chronic abiotic damage as well. And because of that, you can have sort of this complex interaction happening, and it can lead to like a decline or something like that. And there's several of these that have been described over time as well. So disease versus injury. Disease is described as a sustained and or progressive impairment in structure or function. And this involves time. So the important way to, I think about this is that disease really involves the interaction between a causal agent and the host. And there's sort of this back and forth going on between them that leads to the development of symptoms. The pathogen is infecting the host, it's causing damage to the host is trying to respond, and the host is, usually defending itself in one way or another. And over time, that leads to the development of symptoms, which you see. Okay. At some point, you will also potentially see evidence of the pathogen as well, but not always. But it's a progressive process that leads to the impairment of either structure or function in the host. Versus injury, which is instantaneous damage, is short duration. It's not sustained or progressive. So, insect herbivory, insect, damage from whether it be wood-boring insects or leaf-feeding insects, we think of that as injury. Now, some insects can, in fact, vector diseases or vector pathogens. They transmit pathogens by way of some of their feeding activities. And so they may be important in a disease cycle, but they are not considered a disease agent. They're considered an injury agent. Okay. And I just wanted to point that out as we go here, because how trees respond to these things, how we manage them in the landscape, it's all connected technically. So diagnosis requires in trees requires knowledge of the site, and that includes not just the species, but what what those species that you're looking at, what they would require, or what kinds of conditions they're going to want in terms of healthy growth. Several years of history. We want to know what happened 5 years ago, not what just happened within the last 6 months. If you're looking at a tree that can live to be 100+ years old, knowing what happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago is very important. Knowledge of the host is very important. You need to know what species you're looking at. Is it a water oak or is it a live oak, a laurel oak? Those details matter. Careful observation is a very important thing that we must do, and that sometimes requires going below the surface and looking at the roots. Remember, a vast amount of the biomass of a tree and it's doing a lot of the important work is below ground, and sometimes lab work is needed as well. And so sometimes we have to actually, collect samples and have a lab help us with the diagnostic process. Now, one simple thing that we can do, in the field that we can look for, that is an important component in diagnosing some of these diseases, is looking for signs versus symptoms. So signs are the visible evidence of the causal agent. These are structures produced by the pathogen. The actual pathogen itself. So this might be fruiting bodies of a fungus. They might be spores being produced. Sometimes it's vegetative structures like what we call mycelia or hyphae of the fungus. But it's the actual, pathogen that you see. And, you have to sort of catch it just at the right time, because a lot of times you're not going to see this unless you're there just at the right time. And many times there's lots of other fungi present, especially on something that's already dead. And so what you might see may not be the causal agent either. Symptoms are the damage to or abnormal growth of the plant that results from the causal agent. So it's that interaction between the pathogen and the host that leads to that, dysfunction, either in structure or in form. And it leads to these various symptoms that we see. It can be a canker, it could be a gall, it could be leaf spots, it could be stunting, wilting, dieback, many different types of symptoms that we can look for and we can categorize. But we want to look for consistency within symptoms. Consistent symptoms are helpful, and catching them sort of early in the development and understanding what's happening over time is very, very important in the diagnostic process. So, okay, now I want to switch gears for a minute. I want to talk about oak trees. Let's just use oaks as an example. I've been getting, I would say this year in particular, I've had at least 75% of the inquiries I've had have been about oak trees. I just got a call yesterday from somebody who wanted help diagnosing what was going on with their oak trees. So I felt like this would be a good opportunity to clarify some of the causal agents of oak diseases or describe some of the describe some of the common issues affecting oak trees in Florida during this presentation. And I wanted to right off the bat talk about a couple things that don't actually occur in Florida, or at least aren't known to occur in Florida, because we've had a lot of, I think, a lot of misunderstanding or confusion about some of these oak issues, mainly because they are known to be issues elsewhere and have, have a lot. There's a lot of resources, a lot of information on the internet. I think when people find, that they have an oak tree dying, they will do a quick Google search, and some of these things will come up, and so they make an assumption that these issues might be affecting their oaks. And so I wanted to provide you with some detailed information about some of these issues, both the things that occur on oaks in Florida and the issues that don't occur here. But I wanted to start by talking about what doesn't occur here, because there's two major oak issues that have been well publicized that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about. And I'm getting I would say a large increase in people that think that they're finding these things in Florida, but they turn out to not be. The first one, excuse me, let me go back. The first one is oak wilt. So oak wilt is caused by the pathogen Bretziella fagacearum. And looks like my text for some reason didn't show up. So I have some text missing on this slide, but that's fine. I'll just tell you what would be on it. So the pathogen is called Bretziella fagacearum. It's a ascomycete fungal pathogen. It causes a vascular wilt in oak trees. Oak wilt is a disease that has been affecting primarily red oaks, but also live oaks in Texas. And it's been affecting them in the geographical areas that you can see on this map. It's not certain if oak wilt is native to North America or not. There's some debate about that. It has been sort of spreading into some new areas, particularly in the Midwest. But it has never been found in the Gulf Coast east of Texas. There have been numerous surveys for this disease, numerous attempts to try to find it, but in 2023, it has still never been found in the states east of Texas on the Gulf Coast. Now, it is a very important vascular wilt disease in places like Texas. And in Texas, you see crown wilt, rapid wilt of the trees, kind of an interesting pattern of venal chlorosis and necrosis on some of the leaves. But most importantly, you get these what are called pressure pads under the bark, where the bark splits and you get the fruiting bodies of the fungus. The fungus produces these asexual fruiting bodies under the bark, and you can see that's in the lower right there. It's sort of a gray little structure that actually sort of produces pressure under the bark, and the bark will crack open. And that fruiting body is attractive to a number of insects, including what are called picnic beetles and other bark beetles. And these bark beetles will actually then come, they will visit those fruiting bodies, pick up spores, and carry the spores to wounds on other oak trees, whether they be from storms or from pruning activity. And that's how the pathogen is initially introduced into a new tree. The fungus then gets into the vascular system. It causes the wilt, and then it can move from one tree to another by root grafts. And so you get these large patches of trees that will wilt and die. Now, I think one of the reasons why we have a lot of people sort of misunderstanding what's going on with oaks in Florida, because I think there's two things here. One is oak trees can rapidly wilt and die from a number of different things. We have a number of different causes of rapid wilt and rapid death of live oaks in Florida. Anything from flooding to a lightning strike to root disease and the most common thing is actually due to herbicide. And that can lead to symptoms that will look very much like what you're seeing on the left. Sometimes you can get leaves on trees that are stressed and just from other symptoms or other causes that will actually develop that veinal necrosis that you're seeing up there in the upper right, and it's not caused by oak wilt. So the combination of those two things means that people, I think, will see these things and they make the assumption that they have oak wilt. But oak wilt is a very distinct, very unique vascular wilt disease. And there are management practices to manage this in places like Texas and elsewhere that involve fungicide injections to prevent it, preventing the transmission by root grafts, by disrupting those root grafts and things like that. But here in Florida, like I said, it's never been confirmed. This disease has never been found here, despite official surveys, despite many samples being collected over the years. So if you thought that you had oak wilt, you need to confirm it. And there are labs that could confirm it, but it would take a lab confirmation, and that would be highly unlikely. I'm not saying it's totally impossible, but it would be a significant thing if you were to find oak wilt in Florida. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is sudden oak death. Now, sudden oak death is caused by Phytophthora ramorum, and sudden oak death has been causing death to oak trees on the West Coast, particularly along right along the Pacific coast, right around San Francisco, down to Monterey, California, up along the sort of Northern California coast, and then into parts of Oregon, and then a little bit in Washington and in British Columbia. And that area has been impacted since about the mid-90s. And to this day, this particular pathogen, Phytophthora ramorum, has still not been found in Florida. The disease, sudden oak death, has not been found in Florida. What has been found is the pathogen, Phytophthora ramorum, has been accidentally introduced on nursery stock numerous times outside of California. It's been shipped on camellias and other hosts. And there have been a number of these introduction events on nursery stock that led to a big national survey that and honestly millions and millions of dollars to try to look at the potential impact of this. There were risk assessments done where people looked at potential risk of eastern U.S. forests to buy this Phytophthora, and they found that some of the eastern U.S. Oak species are highly susceptible when you artificially inoculate them. However, despite the fact that this Phytophthora was accidentally introduced to numerous locations in the eastern United States, the pathogen never became established. It became established in a few streams, I should say, because it's a water mold. And so the water mold became established in the streams near these nurseries, but it never actually took hold as a disease. And it never infected any oaks. It never caused sudden oak death. And even in some of these places, it eventually went away. And after a number of years of monitoring, it can no longer be found. And that's the case in Florida, because it was actually found twice in the Panhandle and then was never found again after a number of years. And so sudden oak death caused by Phytophthora ramorum is still a significant problem in the West Coast. It causes thousands and thousands of dead trees every year, of primarily oak and tan oak, but there are a number of other hosts as well. But it's very much sort of concentrated along the coastal areas where you have this cool maritime climate. And the pathogen, like I said, it's a water mold, and it infects the base of the trees causes a what we call a bleeding canker, and initially, and so you see these bleeding cankers, and then in order to confirm it, you have to do a lab test to confirm it, because there are a number of Phytophthora out there that could be found that aren't necessarily Phytophthora morum. Now, if you remove the bark off of some of these species, you see these dark water-soaked lesions, which are very characteristic. Now, so one of the things I wanted to point out was that we have other pathogens in Florida, and I'll show you some in a minute, that can cause similar symptoms on oaks. Like we have another Phytophthora cinnamomi, which can cause a bleeding canker on oaks. It can also affect red maple, but it's not Phytophthora morum. It's a different species, a closely related one, in fact, but it's nowhere near as aggressive. It's nowhere near as virulent. It's not causing ecological damage like sudden oak death does. And so if you were to find sudden oak death in Florida, that would be a huge deal, because like I said, it's never been found here as a disease. The pathogen has been found on nursery stock, and then for a number of years, but now that has gone away, and there's never been found a single case of the actual disease that's caused by Phytophthora morum in Florida. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure everyone is on the same page about this. However, we do see other things affecting oaks, and one of the common things that we see on large old live oaks, for example, is we will sometimes see cankers, different types of cankers, and sometimes old lesions that can be the result of old wounds, can sometimes be the result of stress from, the trees may have been under stress under certain conditions. Sometimes it actually dates back to old squirrel damage, because squirrels like to really chew on the bark of live oaks, and can lead to wounds, which then can become infected by secondary fungi. And interestingly, a lot of these live oaks actually have the ability to form new cambium, as long as it wasn't too deep, and they'll start forming a new layer of bark on top of that. But because it was a because it was a wound like this, it's going to look ugly for quite some time. But rarely are these the type of thing that causes any kind of mortality or even death of the branches. And in most cases, the worst thing you might see is you have to monitor them for decay, which is certainly something that you would want to keep an eye on. I have some other pictures here in a minute. I'll show you some of these things, but we see these types of cankers on live oaks. There's several different fungi that can be associated, and sometimes these are associated with previous wounds, sometimes not. There's multiple fungi have been found associated with these. I'm just going to say that the exact causal agent isn't totally known, but we do know that in general, when you see this on a live oak, it's not going to typically kill the tree. It does make them look ugly. And sometimes, branch removals might be necessary if there is decay associated with them. But there's multiple fungi that are causing these types of cankers. And then sometimes you'll see target canker on these as well, caused by neonectria. I can show you that in a minute. But like a tree like this may have branches that look like this. And these are from the same person that sent me these photos. And you can see these are on the same tree. Okay, just to show you the impact. So let me broaden out and talk about some stress-induced disease issues. So these are some things that we might see on urban trees in Florida that are induced by some sort of stress, or stress, whether it be some sort of predisposition that is due to some sort of chronic stress from being in an urban landscape, or it might be something that's more acute. It might be a recent flooding event, or a severe drought that might be happening that's ongoing. Or it may have been from a hurricane that caused damage to the roots. But there's all sorts of different disease issues that are associated with some sort of stress, and I like to sort of frame it that way. A good example is armillaria. We now call it Desarmillaria tubescens, but armillaria root rot, we call it honey mushroom, produces these annual fruiting bodies that are found in clusters. We see big clusters of fruiting bodies at the bases of trees and on the roots, and sometimes on old stumps as well, on any sort of woody debris that's left over from trees that have been cut down. has a very wide host range. It affects a wide range of primarily hardwood species, but sometimes we even see it affecting conifers as well. It causes a white rot in the wood and in the large structural roots, but it kills roots as well. So you get a root rot. And we find this associated with trees that usually on sites where the moisture conditions have changed, whether you see old sandhill species that are now being irrigated, for example. We have turkey oaks that are now in a lawn setting, for example, or some kind of situation where the irrigation might have changed, or maybe you had a very, very wet period for several years, and then you had a very dry period. Any kind of change in hydrology, soil moisture conditions very much favors armillaria. And also we see that there's, if you have a lot of this, like an old oak hammock or something, and then people plant trees into that setting, you will sometimes see trees that have poor root structure from nurseries and things like that. They're going to be more susceptible, but very, very, very common in our area. So you get these clusters of mushrooms a couple of times a year, usually in the fall, but sometimes at the beginning of the rainy season. We also see them, this fungus producing a white mycelial growth under the bark. Recently killed tissue, particularly we see the white mycelial growth. You typically see, a lot of that white mycelial growth under the bark. It's very distinctive, very characteristic. Okay. Now, a lot of armillaria species, or Des armillaria, they would produce rhizomorphs, which are root-like structures that look like basically like black shoestrings that allows the fungus to move through the soil, coming in contact with new hosts. This species rarely produces them, but that's why I didn't even put them in here, because this particular species rarely produces those. But there are other armillarias that do produce them, and they're a little more common, particularly in the panhandle of Florida and in northern areas. So another sort of good example of a root rot organism that takes advantage of trees that are stressed from something, whether it be compaction, soil compaction, drought, too much moisture, too little moisture, any kind of anything that puts the roots in a compromised situation. Ganodermas, and there are multiple Ganoderma species. Their pathogenicity varies. We've done some experiments with them and found that they tend to be actually pretty poor pathogens when you try to infect a healthy tree. It's only when the tree is under some sort of predisposition that they seem to be capable of causing more significant decay. So you might see a fruiting body like the one in the upper left that would be on a tree in a landscape that it may very well be that tree could be relatively healthy. It might be relatively localized in terms of how much decay is even associated with the roots in that case. But it may be that a certain shift in the environmental conditions would allow that fungus to then take advantage of the tree, and you see a decline start to occur. And so there are a couple of different Ganoderma species. We have Ganoderma curtisii, which forms a stalk. We have Ganoderma loose sessile, which is like what you see on the second one down there, which is it's flat up against the host. And so all the species that I'm talking about right now are the ones that occur on hardwood species in Florida. And so they're primarily root, butt, and trunk rots. They can, they start on the roots, but they can work their way up. They move both through root grafts and through spores, and they cause a white heart rot, and they can be either annual or perennial in terms of the fruiting bodies. Okay. And conifers can be hosts in some cases, but most of the time we see them as hardwood issues in Florida. Now, there's one exception I want to talk about here. Oh, just a few more things. They do produce a brown spore print if you want to look at the underside. And there's some species like the artist conch, which occurs primarily on hardwoods, which is well known for sort of this sort of white, what we call context tissue, which can be, or on the spore, the pore layer, excuse me, where you can sort of make art on it, which is kind of neat. But there's one exception to these, which I want to talk about, which is Ganoderma on palms. Now, Ganoderma on palms is a common issue in Florida, and this is really an exception to this whole group of being stress related. because this is the one Ganoderma that we have that appears to really not have any predisposition necessary as far as we can tell. There may be, but nobody has identified what that is yet. What we do know is if you see a fruiting body on a tree, that tree is if it's not dead already, it will be soon. And if it's not dead, it certainly has extensive decay. There's already been some good research being done by Brom Dillon over at Fort Lauderdale on this one, doing some nice work to show the amount of decay associated with these trees. So we know that even if they're not totally dead, they're very likely to fail. And they do almost always die, relatively quickly. So this is a distinctly different type of Ganoderma, Ganoderma zonatum. And it is definitely host specific to palms, and it has a very wide host range on palms. And management for this is really right now restricted to removal of the palm, removing all of the associated root mass, because we know the fungus can be harbored in those roots. If you want to plant another palm back in the location, you have to do a really good job of getting rid of all that contaminated tissue and soil. Otherwise, you may very well have another palm that may be infected, within a short period of time. So that's, right now, the best management for this. But some more information is kind of needed. We need to do some more research on this one, because it's still a little bit uncertain, certain aspects of its biology. But we have done some work on Ganoderma. We have an IFAS publication out on the Ganodermas in Florida, what their host relationships are, how to identify them if you'd like. I meant to put for some reason, the link isn't on here. It should be on this slide, but this came from our research that Andrew Lloyd, one of my former PhD students, conducted on the Ganodermas in Florida. So there's Ganoderma curtisii. Okay, so let's talk about pitch canker. So pitch canker occurs on pine trees. This is a common, very, very common issue on pines. One of our most common diseases, I would say in the urban landscape, this is probably the most common disease issue on pines. If you're going to see a problem affecting pines, it's going to be pitch canker most likely. It's caused by the fungus Fusarium circinatum. It has so the pathogen has a wide host range, but it's mostly affecting pines, and it can affect pines in any stage of their life history. So, and even from the seed to a tiny seedling all the way up to a mature tree. Although it's primarily a tip blight disease, it can infect the roots as well in some cases. But we see these outbreaks, particularly on trees that have been stressed, sometimes by drought, sometimes by wounding after a storm, like a hurricane, for example. If you have a lot of abrasion on small branches, you'll see pitch canker outbreaks on those trees. And then one of the biggest factors we think in urban settings is trees that are predisposed because they have basically they've been planted in situations where there's excessive nitrogen, whether it be because of lawns and the use of nitrogen in turf situations, or the trees themselves have been fertilized when they don't need to be. But pitch canker is one of these diseases where essentially if you add nitrogen to the situation, it's like throwing gasoline on a fire. And most of these our native pine species really don't require any additional nitrogen. They're adapted to low nutrient soils. And so you add additional nitrogen, you're really not doing much to help the tree, but you're adding fertilizer for the pathogen. And that's essentially what happens. There's lots of data and evidence to support this. So pitch canker, it's easily diagnosed because you see this tip blight, dieback, usually on the terminal portions of the tree first. Some of the needles are usually retained, and then we get extensive resinosis, resin flowing down the branches from those dead branches. But this is very classic, typical pitch canker that you're seeing here on slash pines. It can infect any pine species. So we sometimes see it on longleaf, sand pine, loblolly, of course, but slash pine is particularly susceptible to this disease. So we get a lot of resin, sticky, gooey resin coming out, because resin is a defense mechanism in pines. Okay, so the tree is trying to defend itself by producing that resin, and that's essentially what's happening. And so you get a large amount of resin typically coming out of these wound or out of these lesions. It's a lesion, it's a canker. And so that's the most typical symptom. Now the fruiting, it does produce fruiting bodies, but those are kind of hard to see. They typically are very ephemeral, and they're produced usually at the bases of the needles. When the needles fall off, they're kind of salmon colored. So I didn't place them in here for you to see, but they're typically not that commonly observed by most people, unless you really know what you're looking for and sort of catch them at just the right time. So another disease that we see affecting pines, which here in Florida tends to be rather episodic and associated with probably a combination of the right weather conditions and also some stress, is needle cast. So we have a number of different needle cast diseases. Needle cast refers to the fact that basically the pine needles get infected by a fungal pathogen early in the spring, and you get these little, basically tiny little needle spots or little lesions on the needles. And then those spots enlarge and coalesce during the growing season and into the following fall and winter. And by the time the next season, by the time you get to the following growing season, those needles have turned totally brown, and they then drop from the tree. They're cast from the tree, and they're dropped at the same time that the new growth is emerging. And the fungus is producing fruiting bodies in those old needles and producing spores. And so you kind of have this life cycle where the old needles are producing the fungal spores, which are then infecting the new growth. And so what happens is you have a lot less growth on the trees. You have less needles, and of course they're brown during the winter when they should be photosynthesizing. And it leads, if the trees aren't totally dead, they certainly are highly stressed, and they're predisposed to other things like bark beetle attack, to other diseases like pitch canker, and it weakens the tree significantly. And so we see this happening in landscapes. We've had some big outbreaks happening in the last couple of years, particularly in North Florida. We're not exactly sure why. It might be related to weather conditions, but we've been doing some research on that. But there's a number of different needle cast diseases. This is one that affects primarily longleaf pine. It's called brown spot. And you can see the effect that it has on longleaf pine, where, longleaf pine in its grass stage should look like a big clump of grass. They should have plenty of healthy needles. But when they're heavily infected with this pathogen, it basically makes them look completely brown. And so it totally reduces the growth of the trees, and they, it significantly impacts the health of these. These are seedlings in this case, but significantly reduces their growth. And we see that on mature trees that are affected, the radial growth is greatly reduced as well. And so the trees may have been growing well, and then all of a sudden they start getting needle cast, and it just, greatly reduces the diameter growth in the trees. So that tells you that they're stressed and they're likely to be predisposed by other things. A couple of other issues I want to talk about: Latoporus. Latoporus is a canker. I want to talk about a couple of canker rots that we see. So Latoporus it's really a decay organism that gets established in living trees. But the reason I'm going to talk about it is because it's found in living trees. This is a so-called chicken of the woods. Latoporus sulphureus, Latoporus cincinnatus. There's a couple different species. Gilbertsonii. Latoporus gilbertsonii is the most common one we see on live oaks. It produces an annual fruiting body. It's a big fleshy yellow-orange fruiting body that emerges typically during the summer. And this fruiting body, when you see this, you know that you have extensive brown rot decay or brown decay. Brown rot is a type of decay that leads to the loss of cellulose and causes the wood to crumble. And that's why trees that have this, even if they're still living, are very likely to have risk of failure. So you really need to look carefully. It's most common on hardwoods, but sometimes can be found on conifers, but it's very, very common on oaks, particularly live oaks in our area. Okay. So we've been doing some research on this one, but I just wanted to point it out. This is what it looks like, very distinctive. It is edible. That's why it's called chicken of the woods, but it is it's a serious canker rot organism on living trees. Some other canker rots we see, Inonotus rickii. This causes a canker in decay on hardwoods, particularly on wax myrtles but we see this on red maple on a number of species. And most of the year, you might just see a sunken sort of lesion with a little bit of discoloration, you know, and that kind of thing. But when it produces a fruiting body, it produces this very distinctive dark brown, chocolate brown kind of looking fruiting body. Has this almost stringy-like appearance to it. It's very, very distinctive, Enonotus rickii, and it causes a heartwood and sapwood decay, and eventually the trees will fail. Couple of others here quickly. We see Kretschmeria adusta. Kretschmeria adusta is a type of decay organism that affects a lot of hardwoods in South Florida and elsewhere, trees that are in urban situations where they've had any kind of wounding at the base, often due to string trimmers or any kind of lawn mowing equipment. And if they're in irrigated settings, it sort of creates the right perfect storm of situations for this fungus to get established. It's called the brittle cinder fungus because it has a dark, black, crusty fruiting body that forms on the external portions of the host, as you can see in the lower left. Sometimes it's sort of grayish white, but anyway, it looks almost burnt. And then underneath that, you have decayed, dead cambial tissue and dead sapwood, and more decay occurs, and eventually the structural roots become rotted out, and the trees can fail, and trees both die and fail sort of almost simultaneously from this, depending on the situation, depending on how much stress you have. There's a number of other cankers caused by Nectaria species. I mentioned some of these earlier when I was showing you the oaks, but we get what are called target cankers very commonly on live oaks, sometimes on maples and other hosts, and these are found associated typically with trees that have been stressed from one thing or another. Broken branches are good spots where the new infections occur. And then sometimes you see these red fruiting bodies, what are called parathecia, near them. This is a good example of a target canker. This is due to the host and the pathogen interacting over time. Pathogen is causing a little bit of death, and then the host responds and tries to close it over, and it goes back and forth and back and forth, and you end up with a target-like structure. Then we have Biscognoia, the so-called hypoxylin canker. It used to be known as hypoxylin. It's now known as Biscognoia. These are canker rot fungi that can cause large portions of the cambium to die, and then once it dies, the bark falls away, and you get the fruiting structures, which are usually black or gray. And this is associated with trees that are stressed, whether it be due to drought or compaction or something like that. But they're very opportunistic. And here's some more pictures of it. The fruiting bodies, you can see it's replacing the bark as the bark falls away. All right. Enonotus hispidus is another canker rot pathogen. These fruiting bodies are yellow-brown, produced in early summer, about now actually, on hardwoods, and you get these large sunken cankers with then decay behind the canker, and then the fruiting bodies turn black and they fall from the tree. Very, very common on a wide range of hosts, hickories, oaks, lots of things like that. Here it is on laurel oak, and there's what a fruiting body looks like when it's fresh on the left, and there's what they look like as they start to kind of dry up on the right. I mentioned these Phytophthora cankers earlier when I was talking about, should have put these with the sudden oak death photos, but there are some other Phytophtheras that can cause similar basal cankers, and here's what it looks like, okay, on laurel oak. You get these water-soaked lesions, and this is usually associated with trees that are somewhat stressed, older, you know, kind of at the end of their lifespan in an urban landscape. Usually heavily irrigated settings is where we tend to see it. The trees usually don't die from it, but they usually just kind of look ugly and they start to kind of decline. Okay. We also can see it on red maple. Here it is on red maple. Okay. But there's different Phytophthora species, and for confirmation, you'd need to send samples to a lab. Okay. So I want to talk about, I got about 10 minutes, so I better hurry. Some killer diseases of trees. Some of the ones that are really the ones that are actually like causing significant harm in the landscape. Lethal bronzing of palms. we could have a whole webinar just on this topic, and I'm sure you've heard about this, but I just wanted to make sure I put a slide or two in here about it. There's some really good research being done right now by some of my colleagues on this, but it's caused by phytoplasma. That is a bacterial-like organism similar to lethal yellowing. It's transmitted by leafhoppers, but possibly other insects as well. They're feeding on these palms. They're transmitting it into the sap. Causes a rapid systemic death of the palms. People are doing different things to try to manage it. Historically, basically, the only thing that can be done was to treat the palms with antibiotics preventatively. But we know that not all palms are equally susceptible, but phoenix and sables are highly susceptible for sure. And things like Bismarckia are susceptible. But one of the things that is being looked at now, it has to do with management of the vectors, which seem to feed on a lot of weed species, grasses, and a lot of common herbaceous plants. And so both managing those insect populations and even vegetation management, making sure that the palms are sort of separated from some of this herbaceous vegetation, which seems to harbor those insect vectors, could be part of a good integrated pest management program for this. These are some old photos. I need some more updated ones. But with this disease, you get rapid crown wilt, which usually starts with the sort of the lower portion of the crown in the spear leaf, which you see in lower right. On phoenix species, you get like almost overnight drop of the fruit, which happens if they have fruit on them, the fruit will drop very quickly. But we see a lot of cabbage palms that look like the two on the right around Gainesville, and then they turn brown, completely bronze or brown within a few days, it seems like. And lots and lots and lots of urban trees being affected. Not so many in urban and non-urban settings as it appears, and that might be partly due to the vector and to the association with turf, but I think some more research is needed to confirm that and to figure out exactly why we see more of it in urban settings than in non-urban settings. Laurel wilt disease. I'm sure you've heard about laurel wilt. Yeah, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but it's a vascular wilt disease affecting the laurel family, the Lauraceae, both native and non-native laurels, including red bay, swamp bay, and then avocado. It's been absolutely devastating. It's due to the interaction, it's due to the fungal pathogen, which is now known as Harringtonia loricola. The name has changed, but it used to be known as Raphael loricola. And the vector, which is the red bay ambrosia beetle, Xylebris glabratus. These were introduced from Southeast Asia prior to 2002 when they were first found near Savannah, Georgia. And this is an ambrosia beetle, which typically ambrosia beetles are harmless. Typically, they carry fungi into dead and dying trees where they cultivate their fungal symbiont. And really, there's no harm done because they're utilizing trees that are already dead or dying for some reason. But in this case, there's a mismatch in the ecology and such that the beetle is boring into a perfectly live red bay, and consequently the fungus induces a very rapid wilt and death of the tree. The trees die within a couple of weeks, and that has been very, very devastating to the hosts that are susceptible. And so we've had millions and millions of red bay trees die, absolute just, slaughter of a lot of our native Lauraceae. That was what I just told you, so I'm going to skip over that. It has rapidly spread, on both red bay and avocado and swamp bay, but also in sassafras, which is found further north. So in places like Kentucky and Virginia and Tennessee and Arkansas, it's spreading on sassafras, which is another susceptible host. But in avocado groves in South Florida, it's all about detecting the disease early and trying to manage it through good sanitation, because the disease moves through root grafts, like a lot of these vascular wilt diseases. So you need to catch it early, and make sure that the trees are chipped early on if they're found. Don't allow it to spread within a grove, because it will move from one tree to another very quickly via root grafts, and so you get a lot more losses the longer it persists within the stand. So sanitation has been one of the best strategies in these avocado groves like you're seeing here. I Fusiform rust is a disease that occurs on pine trees, and it's caused by a pathogen, Crenartium quercum. It's one of the most important diseases affecting pines in the southeastern U.S. It's a huge problem. It's a rust that alternates between pines and oaks. It's very dependent on temperature and moisture conditions. And in some cases, this can be a big problem. It depends on where you're at. That's a big part of it, whether the climate conditions are favorable and whether or not you have susceptible hosts. But the hosts are either oaks or pines, 2 and 3 needle pines. So slash pines, loblolly pine, longleaf pine, these are all susceptible. And then some oak species or pine species are resistant. Sorry, I went over that so fast. I just want to make sure I finish up here in time. So this alternates between pines and oaks, and in Florida, on oaks, it's not really a problem. It doesn't cause much harm, but on pines, it can be a big problem. And if you have trees that are infected, they're either going to be stunted or they're not going to grow properly, or they may die. And so really the only management for this is to plant rust resistant pines, which are available. But most of the time, they're only really grown by timber companies and people growing pines for timber production rather than in landscapes. So interestingly, we see a lot of pines grown by nurseries for horticultural use that don't have resistance to fusiform rust, which is kind of interesting and something that I thought I would point out. So that's what it looks like when it produces the fruiting bodies in early spring on the pine, which then the ichthyospores are airborne and they infect oaks. I'm going to skip over that. And then lastly, I just wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about something new that we've been working on called Relompigo blight. Relompigo blight is a new pathogen. It's a newly emerging thread blight fungus. We call it a thread blight because there's a number of these thread blights that are found, and some of these are newly emerging in different parts of the world. But we discovered this in 2019 here in North Florida. It turned out to be a new fungus, which we just named Parvodontia relompiga. My former PhD student, Claudia Paez, has done most of the work on this. And this fungus, we don't know where it came from, but all we know is that it is associated with a wide range of hosts. The fungus produces this white mycelial growth on the external portions of the host, like you see on the right. And in some cases, it looks like lightning. In fact, it very much looks like lightning in some cases. And so I came up with the name Relompigo, which in Spanish means lightning. And so we thought it would make a good name for it because it seems to move quickly, it seems to kill the host quickly, and it looks like lightning. So we came up with the name Relompigo blight. It has a very wide host range, including hardwoods and conifers. It causes a dieback and blight. And then it actually decays the host tissue. So it's able to be a saprophyte and a pathogen, both. But you see these white rhizomorph-like mycelial growths on the external portions of the host, which are very, very distinctive. It seems to move on vines and things and spreads very rapidly in understories. These are the locations where we know it occurs so far and on sort of the different hosts that we found it on. And this is not from any kind of official survey. This is just from reports and from samples that have been submitted to the Division of Plant Industry and the Florida Forest Service, and then people in my lab who have collected samples. But it could very well be found well beyond this just since 2019. But the host range is very wide. We found it on many different hosts, many different hardwood species, vines. There's some things that aren't on here, including citrus, which we found it on recently. And it's been found on red bay. We found it on, just a wide range of hosts, many, many, many different things, which is very concerning. Once the host is killed, it produces this white fungal growth on the undersides of the leaves that on the host tissues are almost completely covered with the white fungal growth, and it eventually produces a fruiting body. Fruiting bodies are flat structures that are formed on the stem tissue, and they're just sort of nondescript white. I don't think I have a picture. I should have put one in here, but it just looks like a white flat fruiting body, what we call resupinate fruiting body. But it grows on the hosts very quickly, and it causes a dieback and blight. Here it is on oaks. This is on Afrocarpus or Podocarpus. And then these are on some plants that we did artificial inoculations in the greenhouse, and we could rapidly see the spread of the pathogen from leaves to the host tissue. There's some close-ups of those like rhizomorph-like growths. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about abiotic disorders, but I'm going to run out of time. But I wanted to mention one thing, and I'll be done here in 1 second, is metsulfuron methyl damage. We've seen a lot of damage to oaks, ligustrum, palms, many different hosts in cultivated settings with turf nearby. We see acute injury typically in spring, about 2 to 4 weeks after application. The symptoms are fried foliage. We say fried because it looks like it turned brown almost overnight. Scattered dead branches and patches of necrosis in the phloem. And the symptoms can really look like other things. This is a good example of what it looks like. You see these live oaks. Very often, this is the most classic thing we see. We'll see live oaks that have been, planted in a cultivated setting. You see turf that looks really clean, that looks obviously irrigated. And then the live oaks will variously turn brown very rapidly, whether it be the entire tree or portions of the tree. And this is always associated with metsulfuron methyl use. And metsulfuron methyl is a common ingredient in a number of different products. And so it's in a sulfonylureal class of herbicides. It has selective activity for broadleaf weeds. It was initially developed to kill hardwood trees and conifer plantations, and then later adapted for use as a broadleaf turf herbicide. It's rapidly translocated in plants. It can move both in the phloem and xylem. It inhibits cell division, and I just mentioned that, but it causes this rapid death of the trees. And we see the trees die like very, very quickly. And then we see phloem, if you look at those branches, you see the phloem necrosis, and you can collect tissue at this point, and you can have it analyzed for the presence of the metsulfuron methyl and confirm its presence. I'm going to end it there. I want to make sure I have time for any questions. I don't know if I had left any time for any questions, but if I don't, people can, I'd be happy to.
I've got one quick one here. Have you noticed any like upticks in any particular diseases or issues, particularly in urban areas? I know that like, a couple of years back, you had diplodia show up along roadways and that type of thing. Have there been any really big ones like that have shown up?
Well, we have, and I didn't have time to talk about the diplodia outbreak that we've seen, a number of years ago. I mean, it's been 5 or 6 years ago now, but we have had these outbreaks occasionally with landscape settings where fertilizers have been, have been excessively used. For example, we had one big outbreak on slash pine along the expressway system around Orange County on planted slash pines. It was actually associated with just excessive fertilizer use. And we see that very commonly. And in a lot of cases too, a lot of these pine, when you're talking about pines, you see them planted in situations where they're getting either chlorinated water or high pH water, which also increases the stress too, because pines are typically adapted to lower pH situations. So that increases stress, right? And so there's that going on. We've just recently been asked to look at another kind of new issue going on, which might be something, but we have to look at it affecting oaks. But we'll have to kind of see if it is actually something new or not. But there's been kind of a more recent emergence of trees dying, but it may just be associated with environmental conditions and things like that. So you've had some pretty extreme weather conditions, whether it be the hurricanes, the really, really wet conditions that some places in the state saw a couple of years ago, and then, pretty significant drought this spring. Those kinds of things, tend to favor a lot of the things I was talking about, right?
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, I definitely see like a lot of these just stress in general leading to those conditions that are favorable for the diseases.
Right.
I got a question here. Like if, let's see, would biochar activated charcoal soil applications help remediate MSM potentially?
I have no idea. I mean, it might, I mean, I think by the time you see the damage, it seems like the damage is, I mean, you can't fix the damage, right? You might be able to do something to I guess, quickly fix soils that are damaged in some way. But my understanding is the herbicide doesn't it has a pretty short half-life outside of the plant. So it doesn't last super, it's not like 2,4-D. And yeah, I see what Danny says. I asked, the label says not to plant trees or soil within one applicate without, yeah, no, it's true. It says not to plant, but it also said, so previously, so the labels have been really funny with this. One time, so previously the same label for one of the products, I believe it was Mansion, or it may have been Manor, I can't remember now. It said that it was safe to use around trees and shrubs. But then it said in the exact same label, in the paragraph below, it said, do not plant trees and shrubs in soil that's been treated within 1 year of application, like you said. But on the exact same label, it said, it's not safe, or it is safe to use around trees and shrubs. All right. The point is, I don't care what the label says. It's not safe around live oaks, unless you, I mean, we've done the research on this, and I think we have to really do some, due diligence with these kinds of things. And honestly, there's, anytime you're using an herbicide, you just have to be careful. I'm not saying all herbicides, and this is not any kind of indication that you can't use herbicides. It's just that with this particular chemical, we've seen particular damage, and it's a very distinct thing, and it's something that is unique, and it's something we see. I mean, literally every single year, we get lots and lots of calls about it, lots of people wondering what's going on with their oaks. And we've had, 100-year-old live oaks killed from this, that, led to lawsuits, I mean, there's been many examples. So I wouldn't be doing my job if I weren't communicating this issue to people. Are there questions about it? Absolutely. And I think there's more research that needs to be done to understand why it happens in some situations and not others. I think it has a lot to do with the soils, the time of the year, the irrigation, settings and things like that, perhaps. I don't know. But it definitely is risky to use it around, particularly around live oaks, but there are other hosts, I think, or other species that are affected. I see if I can try to respond to some of these other questions, but I see somebody asking about bald cypress. Yeah, bald cypress is, I mean, in terms of Ganoderma, we don't know of any major issues affecting, or any, Ganoderma doesn't typically affect bald cypress, but if bald cypress are put in on the wrong site, they can still be stressed and sometimes be affected by things. There are some rare, more, I shouldn't say rare, but less common fungi that you can sometimes find on bald cypress. But typically, if you're seeing any kind of weird like dieback or canker issue with bald cypress, I'd be interested to know about it. There are a few things like Botryopsferia type fungi and stuff that can affect bald cypress that are like really stressed, like if they're in a really stressed situation. But there's a lot of insect, like things like cypress squid gall midge you can see on bald cypress. There's certain mites that'll affect them if it's been very droughty and it's been really dry. You'll see bald cypress kind of turning brownish or bronzy looking, and that's due to a certain type of mite. And then sometimes they're affected by a few other insect pests, but there's not, knock on wood, there's not a lot of major pathogens that affect bald cypress, in urban landscapes for the most part. They tend to be pretty tolerant and pretty free of a lot of pathogens that affect a lot of other things.
Okay. Well, cool. Well, I think that kind of wraps up what's in the chat anyway. If anybody has questions, feel free to reach out to us. I mean, we're in the extension system. We're extensions of the university. But that's what we're here for. And yeah, thank you so much for being here for this edition. I've really admired a lot of the work that you've done, and I feel fortunate that like being in the UF system and seeing like all the stuff that you've been working on here in the past 15 20 years now, I guess, almost, that you've been in the system. So
well, thank you. I tried. I'm sorry I ran over a little time wise. I guess I went a little too long on some of that background information at the beginning, but I see somebody asking if the slideshow be made available. We can make it available. I wouldn't mind sharing it if people would like it, and maybe that would allow people to go back over things. And If there's something that I had to go quickly over, you can go back over it. I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, and I'll follow up too with the recording link as well for YouTube, and then yeah, I'll try and shoot you an email, Jason, and get a PDF of the presentation as well.
That's, yeah, no problem. I'm happy to do that. And sorry if I went so quickly. I'm happy to answer additional questions. If somebody wants to email me or something, I'd be happy to do that. We're doing what we can, but it's a complicated, it's a complicated business working with trees. They're long lived. They, they're interacting with their environment for a long time, and it's in an urban environment, there's a lot of things going on, so but yeah, thank you very much for your time, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Take care.
Yeah, thank you.